So we're moving on to the last section of Unit 2. Unit 2 is all about cells. And what is a cell and how does a cell work? And so we're going to move on to talk about cell division and reproduction. It's on page 35, so make sure you're on page 35 in your notes. Now remember, we've already learned that reproduction happens for every single organism. But what we're going to see is that there's a couple different types of reproduction. Reproduction is necessary for organisms to have offspring. In fact, if you thought of reproduction, you probably thought of sexual reproduction, where there's a sperm and an egg and a whole new organism. But some organisms will actually reproduce asexually. Asexually is where there's just one source of DNA and the offspring are identical. And what we mean by identical is identical genetically. Since there's just one source of DNA, all we're really going to be doing is copying that DNA and making an exact genetic copy and having an offspring. Now this happens most commonly in cell division. When we start with one cell and we copy it to make more than one cell. Now the advantage is it does not require a partner, so it's actually very quick. But the disadvantage is there's no variation. You're exactly the same as the parent. And for a population to be stable, we need there to be variation. If all of the offspring are exactly the same, one change in the environment could cause extinction of the whole species. So we're going to be talking in this unit about asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. The important thing to know about asexual is it means not sexual, just one source of DNA. There are a couple important types of asexual reproduction. The first is called binary fission. Now you might have heard the word fusion before, which means to come together. Fission means to split apart. And bi means two. So binary fission means a cell divides into two equal-sized cells. We do want to make a note that this happens a lot in unicellular organisms like bacteria. So our prokaryotes are often going to copy and split exactly into two equally sized cells. The next type is what's called budding. And budding is where there's a miniature version of the parent created. Budding does happen with yeast, our organism that we experimented on last time. And this is actually a hydra. It looks like a plant, but it's actually more related to an animal like the jellyfish. But what you can see really clearly here in this picture is that you have the original organism, and it starts to grow what I call a mini-me. Now this does not mean budding like a flower bud. A flower bud is not actually creating a whole new organism. This type of budding is creating an entirely new organism. And so it's going to grow a miniature version or a mini-me and then release that, and that will become its own new organism. So far we have binary fission and budding. The next is going to be called sporulation. It sounds just like it looks. It produces spores. We do want to include that this is really focused on fungi, including mold. So when you have mold growing on a piece of bread or cheese or fruit, and you're like, oh, I'll just cut that part off. No, that fungi has already produced spores, and the spores are all over that area. So that's why you sometimes just have to throw the whole thing out. Remember, all of these are asexual reproduction, and so this is how we get identical offspring. The next is called vegetative propagation, which you could guess happens in plants, vegetative, vegetable plants. And this is where it uses small stems to grow new plants. This is actually how strawberries reproduce. This is how potatoes can reproduce. If you've ever had crabgrass in your yard, like you've been pulling up weeds and it's this long string with lots of plants on it, that's vegetative propagation. Keep in mind, all about making identical copies. The next is called regeneration, and regeneration is where we're repairing an animal. One of the really common examples for regeneration is starfish, but also lizards. But your body can regenerate as well. So your skin can regenerate. And actually, your liver is one of the only organs in your body that can regenerate. And so we're repairing an animal, but how? How does that animal's arm grow back, or the lizard's tail? And so we're going to put a big exclamation point by through cell division. How do these things happen? It's not magic. It's what we're going to call mitosis, where we make identical copies of cells. And so these are 5 main examples of asexual reproduction. But we're also going to talk about mitosis. And that's where we're really going to be focused in on this unit, is how do we make identical copies of the cells? Now notice, we're saying this is only cell division in eukaryotes. You remember, there's something really special about eukaryotes. They have a true nucleus. And so mitosis is actually going to be, if you'll write this in, division, you can use the division sign, of the nucleus. Now what's in the nucleus? Inside the nucleus is the DNA. And so we're actually going to be dividing the DNA. We don't want to lose any of it. So we're actually going to be dividing DNA copies. In order to make more cells, we're going to have to start by making more DNA and then dividing those copies of the DNA so that we can have, remember, asexual is all about identical offspring. That's what asexual is all about. And so we'll be focusing on mitosis. Just a little preview, you might have seen it before. Remember, we're going to be dividing the cell. Now before we go on to mitosis, you do have a summary box. So please make sure that you complete the summary box. Remember, you need to have at least 2 vocabulary words, and you need to refer to at least 1 diagram in this summary box. But don't just pick any 2. Try to read through and pick what are the big ideas. You might be using more than 2 vocabulary words, but don't forget to do that summary box. That's actually the end of the lecture for today.